Okay, we're about to start. Hi, Michael. Okay, and welcome everybody. I will make a very brief presentation. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you with us. This is a presentation, a lecture that is part of the public program of the school at Ditela, as part of the instant theory cycle. It's a cycle that's been going on for 3 years now. At the beginning, we had David Salomon, then Chris Hyde, and after that, Hernan Diaz Alonso and Marcelin Go. And it's basically a cycle that invites leading architects to propose the generation of architectural theory at high speed, with deep precision and attention to differences. And in that sense, it displays a brief Brussels and a multiplicity of disjointed and heterogeneous ideas that progressively configure a plane of consistency in which initially unpredictable or unthinkable relationships resonate. This particular lecture by Michael was going to be presented by Ciro Nagle, but unfortunately he couldn't make it. He sends his best regards. So let me just introduce you, Michael. I'm very pleased to do this, and it's really an honor to have you with us at the school, at least online. And I hope we can have you at Buenos Aires soon. As you all may know, Michael is the principal, along with Hilary Sample, of MOS, an internationally recognized architecture practice based in New York. Maybe one of the most influential practices at the moment. An office that not only builds buildings, but also makes drawings, writes essays, makes models, binds and publishes books, but let's say ultimately finds different media and ways to enjoy and make architecture enjoyable. Perhaps this is part of a new genre, deadpan architecture, which proposes a kind of joy similar to that which comes from walking along the edge of a very steep cliff or a high wire. If you look down and try to fathom its height, you will fall and miss all the fun. So Michael's writings have appeared in Art Forum, Blog, Perspecta, Praxis, Domus, and Harvard Design Magazine. He's a professor and associate dean at Princeton School of Architecture and has previously taught at Harvard University, Graduate School of Design, the University of Michigan, and the University of Toronto. Once again, Michael, it's a pleasure to have you with us. We'll be receiving through the chat, both here in Zoom and YouTube, the questions or comments by the audience. Yeah.
Thanks, thank you, Manuel. I'm just going to keep it. I liked it when before the recording was and the cameras were on when we were talking, but like thank you so much for the invitation. I didn't really know what I was signing up for when I said yes to some degree, but when it was asked for, I realized I got everything wrong, but maybe that it's productive to some degree. I was asked for 24 theories or something like this, and I realized I just can't do that. The way I approach, I'm not a theorist. I'm an architect for sure, but occasionally I always start, I would say, from like looking at the world first and then trying to understand what I think is going on to some degree, or try to make sense of it, because it is kind of, it's a constant job, or to try to just make sense of things. So, what theory, I don't even, like, sometimes I'm not even sure, I'm not sure how it is in your school, but at the moment, I'm not even sure why we need theory sometimes. Like, what is the point of theory as a discipline or as architecture? And I suppose at some level, it helps us, one, to try to, what I was saying is try to make sense of things, and another to, in some level, I think it has been recently, to kind of inspire novelty or or difference. I would say it doesn't produce good buildings typically. You know, more or less, you could argue that, but on its own right, it just helps us, keeps everything moving, and it keeps us all thinking. And maybe it's that high wire act like you were talking about. So for this, in getting things wrong, I was trying to think about like what is going on at the moment, and I wrote that little text. It took forever, actually, to do, and I know I kept delaying it because I didn't know what to say. And so I have been fascinated over the last few years with, you know, one is this pragmatist conference from 2000. And it was a kind of interesting moment. It's the year I graduated from university, and I wasn't there. It didn't even really register at the time as important to me, to be honest. It's only important now after the fact. But it was at that moment where the post-critical, the projective, the end of theory was discussed. It was this kind of pivotal moment in the field, it seems like in retrospect, where there was a shift, perhaps, and especially in regards to the role of theory. So I wrote this little text. I don't know if I should read it or if that's really weird, but
I think you should.
Yeah, so I'll read it. So the title is Thinking About the Debate Between Cornel West and Rem Koolhaas at the MoMA Pragmatist Conference circa 2000 or 2000. For better or worse, realism is typically pitted against abstraction. Abstraction thinks at a broad scale. It is utopian, theoretical, geometric, diagrammatic, removing contingencies for something more ideal or systematic or meaningful, while realism alternatively is smaller, local, material, and constructed. It engages the messy relativism of contingency. It is what it is. Abstraction prefers theory. Realism prefers history. Some think realism has a socialist agenda against the elitist class politics of abstraction. Some think architecture is a religion of abstraction. Novelty in realism comes through reworking relationships between things already in the world, while abstraction tries to achieve novelty through the rupture of newness or defamiliarization, while remaining abstract, ideological, or tautological, and aloof from things around it. It relies on translation. You know, this also from my experience writing this. I'll just give like kind of director's notes while we're talking. Is like, you know, is also somebody who teaches architecture. So, you know, relies on translation, planar geometry into three-dimensional form into words, music into visual arts, aesthetics into politics, signifiers and meaning and ideology. Realism is indifferent to signification and ideology. It takes deadpan documentary photos of the situation. It operates pragmatically. It doesn't think scientific empiricism and religious belief contradict each other. They just both are. It uses whatever's available in the world, including abstraction. To realism, it's all something to use. It doesn't care if it's completely logical or consistent. It mostly cares if it's real. And like most real things, it can be both simple and complicated depending on your point of view. The more you look at things and points of view you see, the more everything feels distant and abstract. In our world of media, let's say, constructed of disconnected windows, the abstract and the real, I think today have become really vague and interchangeable. Like to try to make the distinction between abstract and real is kind of a tough thing at the moment. Architecture, like almost everything else nowadays, has become a fragmented archipelago of differing realities, each with their own truths, meanings, and value judgments. It's at least where I am, it's become pretty tribal in that regard in some ways. And even though architecture cannot exist without either abstraction or realism, at the moment, it seems that the abstraction of architecture is only further the distance between us, and we should participate in a more local collective reality instead of continually trying to escape it. So I try to explain let's say a problem, and I tried to give some solution, I suppose, or reading to it. But like it does feel like, I mean, I can try to also, I mean, if you think about what we've been through with theory, you know, in even the relationship to form. I also have been really when I started writing this text, I sort of took it out, but I really got into this character, Bernard Huet, who's a French architect, writer. He was an editor at Aujourd'hui. Really interesting character, and he wrote a really great text on called Formalism Realism, and it's in the Michael Hayes theory book. And it's like one of these texts. I was just talking to like about it to Stan Allen, and he just read it. He just read it after I told him how great it was. He's like, I never read this before. It's kind of like one of these texts that was just like in there, but nobody really paid attention to it. I feel like, at least the people I talked to. But it is about a kind of sets up this. So things like from this text, like he was for sure thinking that realism has a class politics to it, that it was, again, and while abstraction was elitist and kind of classist, realism was socialist and more for the people, let's say. But also was talking about, let's say, the Tendenza school as realism, as a project of realism. So like Rossi and Grassi and those characters. So it's a super interesting text, I think. But if you know, thinking about theory and everything, I don't know where we are. I mean, we're in a moment, for me, it seems like we're in a moment of a desire for renewed realism. Like abstraction has for sure caused a kind of fragmentation of the world to some degree, of multiple readings of some things. There's a loss of a kind of commons, especially around architecture. It's just become really just almost tribal. And I think maybe the role of abstraction, and maybe theory even, has played a role in that, in the search for novelty and meaning, you know, like kind of constantly trying to turn architecture into signifiers of different meanings or different ideas or ideologies, or etc.
And do you see,
go with it? Yeah.
Do you see this fragmentation as being expressed as different jargons, or do you think it has a? I mean, is it merely discourse, or there is like material?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of it is discourse, but it does produce a kind of, like I found, like we're in a kind of neoliberal economy of images too, and of things. So theory, like images, kind of floats all over the place nowadays, and it's applied to every situation. So for me, it's like, let's say the images, I as an architect working in New York, or you know, you're confronted with images of things that are probably impossible, but presented as almost commonplace. So same with theory to some degree. Some theories I don't know if you can apply in practice or in architecture, and I don't know how useful they are. I mean, for me right now, the project is not to produce new forms of novelty per se, or at least novelty for the sake of novelty, or for the sake of some theory to express or signify, to illustrate a theory, but it is to be engaged in the world, you know, more, and try to fix things. I don't think we can do a lot as architects, but there are things we can do, you know, and trying to think about, especially when you're thinking about teaching students. For me, it's like we are teaching a kind of naivete a lot of times. Like we're teaching them impossibilities that sometimes I sit on reviews and I just think it's kind of wonderful, like the naivete, but it's also like kind of ridiculous. Like these things will never happen. And they're not like, a student will do a thesis trying to save, like for instance, trying to save all the ecological problems of the world globally, like trying to kind of global solution for pollution and or the environment. And I just think it's wonderful, this utopian vision, but it's like also super naive, and it just doesn't go anywhere. What does it do? Who's it? You know, it might.
Yeah, that sounds something like a bad abstraction of a real problem.
Yeah, maybe that's a good way to put it.
I mean, because at least what you are telling about this thesis and this type of naivety, it tries to address abstractly with real problems, but in a non-real way, or in like
Yeah.
a hermetically closed abstraction.
Yeah.
It seems.
It's
But
always a confrontation, yeah, maybe between the two.
how radically, or how radically would you think about non-theory? Like, would you lose
I still
words?
write, yeah. I mean, that's true.
You know what I mean? Like losing all words, like for good. I mean, it wouldn't be the first discipline to do that.
Yeah, no, I feel like it would be, I'm not to give up discourse or meaning or things like this, but I do think there's got to be a way to find theory. That's why maybe realism is maybe useful. It's still like, let's say, theory, ultimately, but it's not, it's a kind of theory. It's not to say we're just going to be practical architects, but trying to figure out how to, and I don't think we can give up abstraction. Without abstraction, there is no idealism, let's say, which would be pretty sad also. So, no utopian model, no idea of better or worse, even value judgments. So we need abstraction for sure, but it just seems like at the moment, if we're in this balance between abstraction and realism at the moment seems more pressing a problem. I think inevitably it always exists simultaneously too. Like you can't look at a plan, like I think the contemporary model, let's say the model that was previous to now was like the parametric model was this kind of technical model of abstraction, like using technique and technology to produce new forms of abstraction in a way. You could say it was also mixed up with realism in terms of materiality or the kind of instrumentality of architecture. I think at some point that for sure has both realism and abstraction in it. And then after that, I think there has been a reaction to it through many offices, almost to look for low tech solutions, to be not high tech, not technologically driven, but still dealing with like abstraction and realism. I would say it's dealt with in a more traditional architectural way, which is plans are abstract, like grids, simple geometries, circles. The plan is always considered the more abstract drawing in architecture. And then the elevations or the vertical is more of the realistic experience thing. So it's the detail, the color, the material. So it's always these two things. I think I see a question here from Juan. Hi, Juan. I suppose, yeah, if you're talking about the dialectical model.
Maybe we should read it, right?
Yeah.
You want to reply to it's.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
It says, Michael, do you see this Wolflinian strategy of binaries and oppositions, which you keep coming back to, shape versus form, low res versus high res, et cetera, as a realist pragmatic model in itself? I don't know what this last part of that. Oh, it seems like its cash value lies in its generative potential. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's Juan, it's hard to know. I think for me, again, it's, maybe it's just how I structure things, I suppose, to some degree, but it does allow for you to produce value judgments. I mean, I think it's an abstraction itself. I do think we need to be able to navigate, to produce value judgments in the world. So to think something is better or worse, something is more this versus that, it helps to make decisions as an architect to say, I prefer this over that, or this seems more right. I mean, otherwise, yeah, it just helps make value judgments, which is what we do all day long. Like this is more, can be whatever the the words are that you're going to operate with. Wish Juan could pop up here and we could just have a regular conversation. But I don't know if that answers anything.
Yeah, and yeah,
The way to
about
read
values.
things
Yeah,
for me.
yeah,
Don't you feel like I feel like we were talking, it was like I love Ciro and I love Marcelo, and this is very local and provincial to your school, but I feel like even that moment of like going from Ciro to Marcelo, probably a conversation don't want to have on film or whatever this is, but it's like is a kind of shift in the world from a kind of theory abstraction model towards one maybe that's more, not to say that of course the realistic is realistic in his own way and abstract in his own way too, Marcelo, but it's like it's a kind of shift towards more realism to me in the world, and I think that's happening everywhere. I think that is almost like a kind of reaction I see at the moment away from um, less interest in theoretical work at the moment for whatever reason. I don't know what it is. Is that true? I just feel like it is. It's not, it's not,
I don't know. That sounds like a theory, actually.
yeah, I'm sure it is.
Yeah,
I mean, the problem is like, if it wasn't, if I, like you said, why say anything if if you're against theory? And I'm not against theory in any way. Like I said, I mean, I tried to.
no, no, no. I was trying to know how radical was your position, but not in the sense that not saying anything at all. You can say many things that are not theoretical or that they are poetic or
Yeah, that's true.
evocative.
Phenomenological. I think one accused me of being phenomenological recently, but like um, which I think
At
is true.
one point, you read something that I really like. That is, it is what it is. Like there is an article by John Ashbery, the American poet, that is like I read it in Spanish, but in English it's something like respect for the things how they are, and it was about a painter. I can't remember right now, but yeah, in your experience, or how do you address? Because actually, it's not an easy thing to do to reach things or to understand or to describe or to comprehend things how they are. It's I think it's maybe a technique.
Yeah, that's a, yeah. Well, I can say it's like I'm not going to really give a great answer here, maybe, but let's just say as an architect, um, at least the way we've worked, it is more of like we have accepted certain realities in the work. Like for sure, we're not trying to bend everything towards our will. I mean, it is maybe even a bit of a problem. Maybe we shouldn't accept as much as we do. But for instance, like let's say it's something as simple as a pitched roof on a house. At least in the context in which we were working and teaching, I mean, that was seen as, for some, when they see that, and I've had other like faculty and people older than me, like who went through, let's say, Colin Rowe to Deleuze as a kind of shift, as they experienced it. They see the pitched roof as a kind of a semiotic project, as a kind of an image of a roof or an image of a pediment or something like this. And when in reality, it's that the problem for us wasn't that it is an image of a roof, but it just is how it's a kind of way of being. Yeah, it's just a roof, just like an efficient roof that is cheap to build and could, for projects that we were getting, didn't have huge budgets, we would have to try to figure out how to work with it instead of trying to reinvent it completely. I mean, you'd have to figure out how to manipulate it a little bit, give it a different proportions or change certain things about it or material. But it wasn't like you could totally come back and say, you know, something totally different roof.
Yeah, well, I think that I personally find that the respect for things as they are, it's like a starting point, an unnecessary starting point. But with architecture particularly, you necessarily are going somewhere from there. I mean, you have no choice, no choice. You have to do something. I mean, even with that roof, it has to have a certain angle, I don't know, or a certain color or non-color, but again, there is a movement. I don't know, because of its artificiality, maybe.
Yeah, and it's also not just a roof on its own right. It's a roof, its relationship to the roof, to the interior, or to the walls, or to the window. You know, it's not. It's things in relation to each other. I think where maybe meaning is generated in that regard.
Yeah, and I thought there was an interesting point in your text when you talked about science and religion. Like I think not because of science and religion themselves, but because of maybe it's the contemporary or of even more like the dichotomy of our era, maybe. No, something like
Yeah,
that.
sure,
But
that's true.
it's like the
Yeah, it's true.
hyperbolic idea of a dichotomy.
Yeah, it's
But
true. It's in COVID. It's pretty extreme right now. Yeah.
yeah. But in that sense, like I don't know, the realist position or the pragmatist position, just use them. Like they are what they are, and in that sense, you could like fold the text on itself, and you could say, okay, abstraction as well is something to be used. It has its own agency. It's a force of itself in the more concrete way, like people gather to talk about something and they read something, and because they misunderstood something, they do something. So abstraction or theoretical abstraction has its own reality, like its own material reality.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we're part of it. It's got I mean, you know, who takes pleasure, who other than architects takes pleasure in like plans and the shapes of plans, and like it's a really, I mean, I get so excited when I'm looking at drawings and like trying to understand the, let's say, composition or arrangement of parts to whole and stuff like this, and seeing it in relation to other projects I know and what is different about it or what's inventive. And maybe that is also a kind of Wolf-Linian, I guess, model. But I get excited about thinking about things in relationship to other things. But it's, you know, most people don't look at that thing, like they're not going to care about it.
But for me, there is something amazing about that, because in some sense you can do architecture for many reasons, but for sure I think one of the reasons, or the interesting reasons for me, is that you are doing it with an imaginary conversation in your mind with somebody, maybe real or absolutely fictional, I don't know, or a group of people, and that will be a private argument to do something or another thing in the plan. So in some sense, it's not the discourse, because it's bigger than a discourse. It's like the architectural community, let's say, in a very, very, very broad sense, has its influence, right? Like it has a real influence. Most of the times in as a hidden agenda, maybe.
Yeah, the one thing it made me think of, I mean, it's a really kind of pragmatist description you gave in some ways of it. And I was thinking about I was thinking about the pragmatist conference as you were talking about in the Rorty Eisman discussion, which I don't know if it's ever been published. I have a copy of it somewhere, but I don't know if it's ever been published in a magazine, but it's like one of my favorite, or journal. It's one of my favorite texts on architecture. And it's Richard Rorty talking about Eisman's work in Derrida and the relationship between philosophy and architecture. But one of the things also about, he goes through, I think he does there, but maybe it's somewhere else, I'm thinking, talk about pragmatism, and pragmatism for him is a way to have conversation, like a conversational model of thinking where he can talk to other philosophers and not have to take everything they say, but just take parts of it and be able to respond in a kind of more, whatever is useful to him, basically take the parts that are useful and respond to them or take them. And in a way that seems more, it sounds right to me. I don't know, as an architect, but it just is full of, it is a really beautiful text that, I mean, I'll send to you, can give it to students or whoever, but and I think it's powerful. And it basically just says, I don't see the connection between Derrida and, I know everybody else does around me, but I don't see the connection between Derrida and Eisman. He said, I think Eisman does kind of beautiful houses, and Derrida is an important philosopher that's affected me a lot personally. But he thinks it's fine if you're inspired by philosophy to do architecture, but the idea that the architecture represents the philosophy is when he has a problem with it.
And how do you feel about misunderstandings? Because I feel that they are highly productive, like Eisman maybe completely misunderstanding.
Of course.
10 books of Derrida. And
that's what I mean. It's productive. And what I mean, in certain ways, I mean, at some level, it's productive to produce novelty for Eisman for sure, but it didn't really produce, I don't know. It depends on what you want the results to be. I think, for instance, for Eisman, I'd rather make real buildings in the world as an architect, let's say, for me. I think for Eisman, it doesn't matter. Like, he's happy doing drawings and ideas. In fact, if anything, he always said he couldn't design his own house because it would be like living in his own head or something like this. For me, that's not a problem. The other things that came out of the conference, though, at that time, which was, we should probably talk a little bit about for me, the two big debates were the two big discussions were the Rorty Eisman, and then also the West and the Cornel West Koolhaas, which we didn't really talk about. And it's the title of the piece, I suppose. And for me, the Cornel West Koolhaas is kind of a moment, just represented the moment we're at, where Rem, this is 2000, I don't know what was going on then. It was after the MoMA competition, maybe. In New York, and he sort of presents sort of the architect, the kind of intellectual architect as a kind of global citizen. Kind of talks, he doesn't understand why the framework of the conference is kind of about American pragmatism in a kind of nationalist way. And he makes these funny jokes like, why are you inviting me in America to an American thing? And he said that wouldn't happen in Europe. Basically, you don't go to France or Germany and have a German conference, but and he sort of represents a kind of neoliberal global architecture model, and one which is, I think, relies on data, rationality. It's like a kind of super clear, rational, intellectual, global architect. And, he's like really good at this and smart. And he represents that point of view. And then Cornel West says, wait a second, he's more cautionary tale in my mind to Rem. He says, if what you're describing to me just sounds like capitalism, essentially. He's like, as you get rid of history, because he's like, I don't care about nationalism. So because Cornel was like, even if you get rid of nationalism, which I find very hard to deal with personally, because I think it's so complicated and difficult subject. But it's like, even if you get rid of these histories, you know, you just produce a vacuum in which the market and capitalism takes over. Money will just fill it in, the void, and just, you know, architects will just do what the market tells it to do. Said without these kind of specific histories and specific narratives of architecture, even the ones we're talking about of theory, you know, what do you have as a culture ultimately? And so I think Cornel West was kind of promoting a more, in a weird way, he was promoting more of architecture, and he was promoting more of history, and he was promoting a kind of a version of architecture which is more in the humanities, less in the sciences. And for Koolhaas, it's more rational and maybe more scientific even to some degree, although it isn't his work, but the way he talked about it, the generic, also this generic subject, which is kind of devoid of specificity and identity and stuff like this. And I think we're contending with this right now in the field.
Well, I read the article because you sent it to me, but I think there is a highlight when Koolhaas says he reads the letters that he received in his office.
Yeah, that's funny.
With the demands.
Yeah.
And if I recall well, he had like one demand was from the Qatar, no, not Qatar, but Dubai, to build a huge palace, $600 million, I don't know. And the other one was a master plan, and the other one was
to be the villain in the Bourne.
To be the villain in Bourne's, I don't know, the Bourne movie.
Yeah, the Jason Bourne movie that's just coming out.
Yeah, because I thought that is the moment when Koolhaas is saying, no matter how rational you are, things are irrational. So, like,
yeah, you're just, I mean, he's like, I mean, it's a postmodern neoliberal point of view where it's like you surf the market, you surf capitalism, and you try to do judo on it. You try to make it do things it doesn't want to do on its own. And in a way, he could do that. I also don't think that necessarily that Koolhaas and West are exactly opposites. I mean, they're, you know, it's not so binary, but they just represent maybe slightly different emphasis. So it's like you know, for it, you know, basically for me, what came out of it is, it's not that Koolhaas is necessarily wrong, but I think that kind of view of just being able to surf the market and being able to get it to do things on itself is more complicated nowadays. I do think that, let's say, national identity, politics, I mean, it's always been there, honestly, but it was sort of suppressed in that regime of kind of globalization, a global market, is now more on the table, and people are kind of trying to rethink the meaning of it and the thinking of what it means for how we structure identity, even in a basic level in the field. It's more complicated. Like where, you know, it's actually done all the time, but it's not really done. It's done through more commercial lens, but it's not really done through, for me, this is more about pedagogy, probably more than anything. Like, how do you teach architecture? That's basically what this whole text is about. It's not about being an architect. Being an architect is we're probably all like Koolhaas to some degree. We're all just trying to make do with whatever the situation is. But you know, do we teach architecture as a kind of model where you do a diagram, you have a text, and you have a kind of clear rational argument, and you present that? Or do we present it as let's say, architecture as a kind of history with its problems and flaws as well, but a kind of trying to understand its history and present it to students and how to think about it? Like we were talking about before we started, like I don't know how you can talk about like someone like John Haydock, you know, through a rational, like try to present, like you present John Haydock to a student and say, well, why is it like this, you think? And, you know, they'll try to say, oh, well, there's some functional reason. I mean, everyone wants to rely on a functionalist narrative. So it's like, there's some reason why, you know, it has to be like this. And, you know, then at some point, all all of that kind of breaks down the more you look at it, and you realize there's just no good reason for this to exist, honestly. Like the wall house, like there's no rational reason for it. It's just, it is there, but it was a game. I mean, it was playing with certain things. It was really productive in the field, but it's not, it's the belief in it is religious almost. If anything, it's like we believe in it. We want it to be architecture. We understand it to be architecture because we are in it and we can see it in relation to other architecture, and we can understand its invention and novelty. And we can understand it as through a historical disciplinary model, let's say, not through rationalist scientific model. So it's not to say that, I'm not trying to say one is, in a way we always balance it. Sorry, I'm actually at Princeton right now, so you're hearing
Taurus. Yeah,
Mario Gandalzonis going by. But the you know, I forgot what I was saying now, but anyways.
No, but the wall house. I mean,
yeah.
Do you like it?
Yeah, I like it. But I mean, like, how do you, like, I even think in our, you know, in your, I don't know, as an architect yourself, like how can you rationalize everything? I mean, we work with science and data and empiricism, and we measure, everything is measured. We're rational people. We have to deal with budgets and economy. But the pleasures of architecture for me are more in its situating it within the field of architecture, like to understand it. I don't, like within other histories, within other, around with other architects' work, in a way, very provincial kind of understanding of it to some degree. So, whereas the other one is not provincial, it's kind of objective, scientific. It's measurable. It's easy to argue. It's easy to get someone on board. If you said to clients, "This is a more efficient building than that," they'll probably want it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I mean, it's tricky. The provincial thing is tricky because I don't know if it's provincial because it's
local or something, maybe.
No, not. I mean, not even. I don't think
smaller. I don't know. It's just like a smaller group.
No, yeah. Because I mean, it can be global. I mean, you can be sharing the pleasure or the enjoyment or the, I don't know, the euphoria or the crazy ideas that you have for the wall house, that with somebody that has no background, you share no background or no
yes,
local.
That's true. It's not like, yeah,
so
that's true.
In that sense, I don't know, it's something like a strata or a plane that cuts through, I don't know, provincialities, actually.
Yeah, I don't mean it provincial in that regard, but yeah, you're right. It's smaller, like, because like, for instance, the people who I consider that I'm talking to, I don't actually live with in architecture. My architectural colleagues and peers and friends, like the people, like I'm sure you do, late at night, everyone, when you get a drink, you're just always like, oh, have you seen this building? Blah, 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 you know, talking about the, you know, everyone has opinions and you argue about it, but that is kind of, the culture of it is around these kind of buildings or things that are going on, but they're not really local to me. They're like most of my friends are all over the world to some degree that I'm in conversation with. And I feel like even as an architect that I'm in conversation with, like trying to maybe sometimes do something that differently than what they did in response to it, or thinking about things, and I don't know. So
well, I think there is a, I don't know, a nice idea there, like the idea that one makes architecture for friends. I mean, not actually the clients being your friends, or the students being your friends, or whatever, or the journal, or I don't know, but the idea that you're doing it for a friend, I don't know, I find that is
community. You could say like an architecture community or something too, or something like a kind of specific community of friends. Yeah.
Yeah, friendship is more open, maybe. I mean, it comes and goes, and one can have imaginary friends also, you know? Like,
yeah, yes, for sure. For sure. I have imaginary friends. I mean, yeah. Who do you feel like you're in conversation with in your work?
imaginary friends, but
Yeah,
but
imaginary.
actually very close imaginary, like actual real friends that
Yeah.
I made some sort of weird abstraction of them, and I am talking with them. But it doesn't work when it works in another degree when I talk to them
And
in
sometimes
reality.
you're probably your teachers or your, I'm sure there's others in that conversation of
Hmm.
imaginary friends. Like for me, for sure, I like certain teachers or colleagues that tormented me as a young teacher. I feel like I'm always in conversation with them.
But is it a discussion, or I mean, is it a loving conversation, or I don't know, a tender conversation, or is it like people are shouting? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. So in some cases, I'm sure there's never shouting, but I'm sure in some cases it's like, yeah, I'm sure in some cases it's kind of confrontational, but it's not, I don't know. I don't know. This is a very abstract conversation right now. So like, um, yeah, I'm not sure,
Well, I
sure
think
where.
that there was an initial question that I find it, I don't know how to answer it actually, but I find it very interesting that this, you said like, do we need theory, or what do we need theory for, or
Yeah,
how do we, but
I
and you made it
even
more
think about
specific
this a lot. Yeah.
when you say, maybe the question is, do we need theory to teach?
Yeah, or to practice. I mean, teaching is more interesting question. Like for sure, the model. In some places, the model is purely technical. Like you
Mhm.
teach a technical, it's a technical school, architecture. And for sure, where I'm at, I'm like in Princeton, the epicenter of at least from the U.S. perspective of theory. Um, for a while, it was the epicenter of theory here, but at some point, at this moment, theory. I don't know. Like at some point, theory now has become so removed. I mean, like from what architects do to me, that it's for its own sake. It's not even, there isn't really much theory anymore anyways. It's more history. But it's become it's for its own community in a way. It's not really, it's like theorists and historians talking to each other more than they are talking to architects. So I may
But
be
but
wrong.
in that sense, how do you feel about the manifestos?
I mean, I always like them, but I don't think they have any as much traction nowadays as they once did. I don't know. Can you think of the last, I may be wrong about this, but
You actually wrote one recently, right? Or I don't know if you consider it a manifesto, the dam architecture, is it?
oh,
That, yeah.
that was because, yeah, that was written as a kind of manifesto, but it was also like somebody had approached us to write about dumbness for a student journal. And
Okay.
so we did it and put it on Instagram, which is pretty ridiculous. Um, but it was also trying to look for, it was in a way, it's also trying to, I don't really even know if I can get into it too much, but it's like it was a riff off of also of Kenneth, there like on dumbness, a Kenneth Goldsmith.
Ultimately,
Yeah. And kind of
no creative, yeah.
yeah, and it was a kind of thinking about that in relation to architecture. It was very simple text in a way, and the kind of generosity of, in a way, it's tied to. It's also somewhat related to the realist, I guess, argument to some degree too. There's a kind of an anti-elitism, perhaps, to it, um, um, for better or worse. I thought you were going to say indifference, the indifference piece, but like because that's usually the one people associate with me at the moment the most. I feel like wherever they want me to talk about indifference, and that that is like what I meant by the starting about with stuff in the world in a way. Is like theory to me, it comes out of how I see the world, like a way of reacting to things around me, and then trying to find a theory that deals with it, or a kind of an understanding of it. And so indifference is just like seeing what was going on and understanding it. And it's kind of after the, like what happened after the parametric project sort of fizzled a little bit in the academy, or in my, at least when I was watching it. And I thought it became, people gave up on it probably, Schumacher probably killed it in a way with all the ideology and that he tried to put on it. But it people started reacting in a different way, and it became a kind of reaction against ideology itself, and trying to not claim anything but accept everything, and like just mash it all together and not really talk about it that much. It was, to me, it was, you know, I was comparing it to like Jasper Johns, or a moment of cooling down after abstract expressionism. And if anything, the parametric project was a kind of expressionist moment for me. I mean, it was both rationalist, positivist, and also expressionist, which is a weird combo, because those two are kind of usually considered opposites. But, you know, it's usually gestural, it was usually sculptural, but then argued through very mathematical or positivist logical terms. Sometimes sun angles or something. There'd be other things involved, but it's, you know, mathematical equations, tiling or something like this. You know, it was after that moment that I think people just there was a reactionary thing against it. I suppose if anything, what you can accuse me of is I tend to think of architecture as a kind of reactionary discourse, in a kind of relational one, where it's like I see things in relation to the things around it, and kind of either it's trying to move things in a different direction or respond to it. And if anything, that response and reaction is a kind of sense of community. Also, like you were saying, I suppose it's sort of
Well,
is what holds us together.
there is something maybe paradoxical in that usually that position tends to ugliness, you know, like aesthetic reaction tends to ugliness because it's a reaction to the established values of beauty, let's say.
Oh, I see. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, but in your case, I wouldn't say that in your office you make ugly things. Maybe.
No, I care about beauty. I still care about beauty.
So there is an interesting, like, internal misunderstanding. I don't know.
No, you're right. I mean, that's the role. That's the, let's say, the most the promise of the abstraction. At least when I was, that for me, that I was really interested in as anybody is a kind of, well, anyways, the one of the things is like is to change received values, or the institutional critique of aesthetics and things like this, to understand like that you can go to, that was the shock of the new, the Shklovsky's like artist technique, the defamiliarization project, the idea that you follow kind of in almost techniques to produce something that you couldn't imagine aesthetically, and it would produce ugliness or new forms of beauty. This was always the project of a kind of certain form of modernism. You would do chance operations, you would do positivist tricks, you would do whatever it is, and it would take you out of your, like, you know, the problem is yourself to some degree, like take you out of your own self, and to be able to move forward, you know, whatever that means. I don't know if we can still do that anymore. I feel like all that stuff has become known techniques, and in any ways they have produced their own beauties and enthusiasms. In a way, that's part of the fragmentation of reality that I'm talking about. Like there isn't, I think for that to work, that has a kind of very clear institution it has to react against. Like the indifference group, let's say Jasper Johns or Rauschenberg, they had a really clear target of like abstract expressionism, of like Pollock, you know, Franz Klein or whatever, like a really kind of, that were kind of seen as also American artists in like, you know, on the covers of Time Life magazines or whatever, you know, expressing freedom or something like this. And so, you know, what does Johns do? He just does like a weird little flag or something, you know, kind of making, in a weird way, I think of it as kind of making fun of, but it's also more complicated than that. Like this idea of, you know, expressing freedom or expressing American values or something like this. And, but it's becomes this weird reactionary model, I suppose, between them, of like the kind of, in architecture, I think it does that too. I think we've just gone through one of the most incredible, technologically expansive moments of our field. Like the parametric model, the technological model, it's, you know, new ways of drawing, new ways of modeling, new ways of rendering, new ways of doing simulation, new way or measuring buildings, new ways of getting data on things, new ways to understand sites and stuff like this. And I mean, just endless, like all the inventions that have happened. And in some cases, I think there's been, and there was a promise with it too, that it was going to make things better. It was a utopian promise to a lot of that stuff. Like I remember as a student, even like being told that, you know, the parametric, and we started off this way as an office, even with some parametric, like small little parametric projects, but like the parametric was gonna, like mass customization, like you could do anything now. I remember teachers telling me this and people going, you could do anything and it's going to cost the same as if it was just repetitive. Like you could do these most crazy things. And so we wanted to believe it, everybody. And so, you know, we'd start off doing it and then you realize it's like not the case at all. It's like all the labor was on you. Usually it's like you're doing some weird installation with it or something. You're trying to do some small project with this using these techniques. And it was not at all, it wasn't the same problem as if it was repetitive. There wasn't an economy to it. It was way more expensive. It was way more labor and time. It was just totally not, the promise of technology is not, if anything, it hasn't lived up to what the utopian fantasies we want it to be. So in some ways, the Indifference project and a lot of the stuff we see nowadays, I think, is in reaction against it. Like, and the dumb thing was probably a reaction against it too. Anyways.
Well, yeah, I was thinking that when you sent the text that you read today, I was, at the moment, I thought you were arguing for a new realism, or I don't know, some sort of realism or some sort of pragmatism, but I don't know what do you think about it. But after this conversation, I have the feeling that you are arguing for or hoping or working for a new theory, actually, one that is able to put in movement all these problems and all this, to forget about these old tricks, you know, tricks that work only one time and they've already been used.
Maybe, I don't know. It could be. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't have an answer, but I think, I mean, I think if anything, it's not to be against. I wasn't trying to put this as like, to me, it was like to say the text was like, you know, these things are intertwined and almost you can't escape. Abstraction and realism are kind of all mixed together ultimately. It was starting off by trying to set it up as a dialectical model and then ending with it being just not that. It's like somehow all smushed together now. But at the same time, within this kind of new, whatever this concoction is of, like in a way, like how I was trying to describe the parametric as both expressionist and positivist.
Mhm.
Like the moment we're in now is both abstract and real. If anything, what we, even within this concoction of like where it's hard to make sense of it, of what is abstract and what is real, is that maybe we still need a little more real. Like that was it. It was
Okay.
try to end it. It was that in the end. Only because I'm worried that abstraction, like that the project maybe is to think of a collective real, like what is real in a moment, for like what do we want real to mean as a community, as a collective project almost. I think abstract is less, it's always going to be broken more into smaller groups, like ideological or aesthetic, or you can name the names, political, like even for architecture. But the idea of whatever we understand, what is the real, like if we could figure that out maybe at the moment, what we want to think about that might be helpful. I don't know, it's so abstract actually. Anyways,
Yes, it's a reality of its own, but maybe we can, I mean, I think we could go on and
yeah,
maybe
we can end on
forever.
this.
And
Yeah,
when you get to that point, it's a good moment to wrap up or to end. So, Michael, once again, thank you for your presentation. Hope we can have you at Buenos Aires soon.
I'd love to come. Anyways, it was nice talking and meeting in person. Pleasure talking with you.
Yeah,
So
the same.
we'll stay in touch.
Yeah. Okay. See you soon. Thank
Bye.
you, Michael. Bye-bye.